Hello guys, Tops here. Welcome back, and today I have the Battle Brothers planner and we will make a guide of all the builds that I commonly use in Battle Bros and some more specialized builds. I say these are all the most common builds, roughly, I don't know, 20 builds or something. And yeah, these are the current builds that we are using with all the DLCs in mind. Keep that in mind. All the DLCs, Flesh and Oath, Beast and Exploration, Warriors of the North. All of these builds require the DLCs or are made in mind with all the DLCs. Most builds work without the DLC, but something like the cleaver, I think, doesn't really work without the DLC. Anyways, let's get right into it. So I structured this by having the early game builds that are kind of the builds that you do with your bros that have basically no high stats and not good gear. So these are the early game builds. Then we transition to the early mid game builds, and the mid game builds who are kind of like for bros who have a little bit better stats and maybe a little bit better gear. And by the way, early game is like the first 20 days of the game, and then mid game, early game is like to like day 40, the next 20 days. And after that, we are kind of slowly transitioning to late game. All of these builds that are not marked are the late game builds. And then we come to the special builds at the end that are for specialized bros most of the time and are kind of, they're not generic. You might still want to build them, but most of the time you need to find a special bro in order to build them. Or they are very special builds by themselves and not, don't require a special bro. Anyways, this also shows you what stats are important for the bro and what kind of generic equipment we have for the bro. So we start with the early crossbow guy. And this is kind of, if you do the normal starting run, you have a crossbow guy already. So you have a crossbow, basic armor. The only requirements is somebody who has like decent range skill. And the crossbow has additional hit chance, so it's nice to have that early on. It's also fairly high damage against armor early on. And this is how I like to build them. I like crippling strikes executioner on them. Because of the high armor penetration, you have a very high chance of injuring on the first shot, and the executioner benefits from that. Gifted for more stats, and then crossbow mastery for even more armor penetration. Obviously, you could go, instead of crippling strikes, fast adaptation for more chance to actually hit something is also decent. But you shoot only once per turn, so don't have that high of a benefit from fast adaptation. But it still might be worth it, better than crippling strikes, right? Can also go for Colossus or some early game stuff. This is how I like to build early crossbow guys. And note that most of the early guys, I only have the first 4 or 5 perks marked because these bros tend to die before they reach like magic level 7, where you either take nimble or battle forge. So these are the super early game bros who tend to just die. Let's continue with the second range bro. It's the thrower, the early thrower. Again, a bro kind of want to have somebody who has like decent range skill or something. Again, basic like equipment, whatever you can find. This is throwing spear, doesn't have to be a throwing spear, can be throwing javelins or axes. The idea behind this is you want to have this guy benefits highly from fast adaptation because you can throw 2 times per turn. So there's a higher, very, very high hit chance with them. Executioner crippling strikes is also pretty good on this build because you have fairly high piercing damage and fairly high damage in general. So high chance to injure something early on. Gifted for more stats, Colossus for more stats, and throwing mastery, obviously. And the throwing mastery is actually something you want to rush as fast as possible because this gives you increased damage on short range. So you have additional hit chance and increased damage on short range. This might be the highest DPS early on that you can have. right? And has very low requirements. Again, just a bro who has some decent ranged attack, nothing else. Let's continue with the early stun bot. The early stun bot is a guy with a mace, basically. This guy, you want somebody who has decent fatigue and maybe some melee skill, maybe. And you kind of just go fast adaptation, Colossus. You kind of want to rush Mace Mastery, so you have 100% chance to stun on a hit, not 75% chance. And you just take the backstabber and the fast adaptation for additional hit chance. Colossus, so you don't die. Maybe Shield Mastery, Shield Expert, if you can afford this. And then you just run around with your shield and your one-handed mace and you just stun people. And if you survive, maybe later you can get nimble and get a 200 mace or something. But these are kind of like the early game bros that tend to die a lot. But it's very flexible, very good early on. Just running around, stunning something dangerous that is a threat to your team. And early on, something like a Brigand Raider is a threat to your team, or especially something like a Brigand Leader. You can just walk up, stun this guy so he doesn't kill your whole team, right? Or your bros. All right, next one, early polearm. Early polearm build is the same. If you find something like an ancient pike or pike early on, you have a row with just basic equipment. You want somebody who has decent melee skill. Most of the time you tend to build these bros who have like very low stats, very low HP, very low fatigue, basically no defense, but they have decent attack, so you can't frontline them, but they can hit stuff. And that's when you kind of want to do, and if you have a pike, you kind of want to make a early polearm build. Again, something like fast adaptation gifted for more hit chance, and backstabber for even more hit chance, has an even higher synergy with two ranged weapons, two tile weapons, right? And then polearm mastery, so it reduces your skill, and you can actually take then Pathfinder and walk around and hit. Really flexible, this build. And again, early game, the pikes tend to have, are the same like your throwers, they tend to have the highest DPS early game compared to your one-handed swords and spears, right? By the way, generally speaking, if you have like the normal trash early bros that you recruit, you kind of give them whatever weapons you have, but you kind of want to give them spears, because spears have plus 20% hit chance and swords have plus 10% hit chance. So early on stuff, additional hit chance is really good for your bros. That's why you give them sword and spears, and something like fast adaptation, which gives you pluses to your hit chance. All right, so now the next build is the spear build. Again, these builds, especially early on, there are a lot of flex perk. You can also go for more defensive with Colossus, dodge or something, or steel brow, I don't know, executioner, crippling strikes for more early game damage potential. But this depends on the bro. In general, having additional hit chance early on bros that have low attack skill is really nice for ranged and melee. Anyways, the spear. It's kind of the early mid-game bro, where you can take stuff like fast adaptation, Colossus, maybe some dodge, and then you get spear mastery. And this guy is just there for the spear wall. It's a bro. It's kind of nice to have a little bit fatigue, a little bit HP on him, so somebody who can kind of get surrounded a little bit. If these bros, they tend to survive sometimes, and if they survive, you want to give them dodge, nimble, underdog, so the surround bonus gets cancelled, some shield expert, and maybe indom. I like to do indom once in a while, so they are kind of a little bit of an aggressive spear tank, right? This is more or less a spear tank build if these bros survive, right? I like these later perks of underdog, nimble, indom when they get there. If not, you just take the early game stats perks that make them more survivable and do more damage. But again, bro with very low requirements and basic radar gear. on basic brigand gear will do just fine for this build. Pretty common build. I think most of you guys already have built your own spear bros. So then we continue. We had the spear. Now we come to the Greatsword build. This is an early mid game that I tend to build on bros who have decent hit points, fatigue, resolve, and melee defense, but very, very low melee attack. So I can't make them anything good, but the base stats are decent. So it's not a throwaway bro, right? And I think we all had that when we had like a decent bro who just had horrible melee attack. And if we have something like this, the great swords or swords, the big swords, they also give plus 10% hit chance. And with sword mastery, you even get plus 10% hit chance on your AOE attacks. And this is kind of the idea behind this build. You have reliable AOE early on decent bros that aren't really late game potential. Because of the low melee attacks, you can't really make them a very good two-hander. But with additional 10% hit chance from sword mastery, they are good DPS early on. And this is kind of a tempo build. I like to go stuff like Colossus, Pathfinder Gifted, Sword Mastery, and then a Nimble, of course, with Underdog, Berserk, Killing Frenzy. So it's a damage, AOE damage build. And we have the Berserk, we have the Killing Frenzy. And then I like to do just all-out damage on these kind of bros. You can go for Dodge if you want, but I like to go Headhunter Executioner just for more damage. And because these bros have reliable AOE, the Headhunter can proc in between the AOE swings, so you have actually, these damage perks, they stack with AOE attacks. They benefit more if you have AOE attacks. They're really strong with the AOE attacks. And you make him nimble for more survivability and also for the fatigue, because this is a very fatigue-intensive build. If you can Berserk, you will spend a lot of fatigue on these builds. That's why you need bros that have decent hit points, fatigue resolve, decent melee attack, decent melee defense. So they are kind of frontline-ish, but their only downside is like the low melee attack. That's when I build a Greatsword for the early mid game. It's also generically worth building for bros that aren't complete trash, because this build is really strong against opponents that don't have a lot of armor and have high HP, because the Greatsword does really high hit points damage. Its damage is 85 to 100. Is really high base damage. Actually, one of the high. I think it's the highest base damage in the game, together with the Great Axe. And this is really good against high HP targets that don't have a lot of armor. Early beasts, brigands is good against nomads, and all of these fights. Orcs, if you want to fight early orcs, these swords do a shit ton of damage, especially because of the reliable AOE in the front line, the swing and the split. And you can potentially swing or split twice per turn with Killing Frenzy Berserk. So your damage, these guys are kind of the trash clearer, and these guys also good against early undead fights, zombie fights, right? So having these early trash clearers can help you in fights that are kind of like damage races. And this build is designed to do a shit ton of damage against low armored opponents and weaker opponents. It's designed to kill a lot of weaker opponents per turn, so you don't lose the damage race to zombies or beasts early game. Faults of late game because of nimble, and it's like generally, nimble faults of, I would say it like day 100 plus. You have fights where nimble just gets destroyed by ranged attacks, too many ranged attacks, or by the big orcs and chosen barbarian camps where they have big cleaving attacks that do bleeding, and they just eat your nimble bros alive. So that's if you approach late game content like day 100 plus nimble faults of hard, then you kind of want to transition to Battleforge generally. So all of the early game, mid game builds, they are always nimble, and all the late game builds are generally Battleforged. This is kind of how I would see this. In general, there's also a good rule of thumb. All the perks, the weapon mastery perks left from the sword, the mace, the flail, the hammer, the axe, the cleaver, are all the nice two-handed weapons for late game. You want to build around these two-handed weapons for late game. And the sword and everything right from the sword are kind of the early mid-game tempo build weapons for approaching the early and mid game that tend to fall off late game because of the damage. So the swords, the daggers, the pole arms, the spears, crossbows, bows, and the throwing weapons, right? Another rule of thumb, just if you're interested. It's kind of maybe interesting for newer players. It's easy to realize. These ones, the big two-handers for late game, everything else for the early mid game. All right, then we come to the crossbow polearm build, a build that I really like because of its high flexibility early game and its high output. Requires a bro who has a decent melee attack and range skill. So if this is a hybrid build, because you level melee attack and melee and a ranged attack, maybe a little bit melee defense. And if you find a bro who has decent melee attack and decent range skill, you can make him into this build. The idea behind this build is the flexibility from the polearm with Pathfinder and the flexibility of the crossbow early on with crippling strikes, executioner, headhunter, killing frenzy, berserk. It's a nimble build, so my idea behind this build is I go only one defensive perk, which is nimble, and I try to do all the other perks into damage perks. And if you put all the perks into damage, fearsome is also a thing, so you could swap Pathfinder or quickhands for fearsome. If I have 5 damage perks in this build, the damage goes really high through the roof, because especially with the crossbow and the crossbow mastery, you have a really high chance of first hit injury and then setting up executioner for your other teammates or for yourself. With the polearm, you have the flexibility of the polearm or the sword lance, if you get a sword lance for a lot of AOE. Same goes for the crossbow mastery. You can also have guns with your crossbow. So this guy could potentially be a sword lance or gunner late game. Somehow these bros tend to survive till the late game, and then you have, with polearm mastery and crossbow mastery, a lot of flexibility, and you have a lot of damage builds, all the damage perks. So even late game, this thing does fairly high damage against a lot of opponents combined with sword lances or guns, potentially. This is kind of how I build them. This is for the mid game, just the pike and the crossbow. This build can shine if you find famed versions of pikes and crossbows and whatnot, maybe guns. This is one of I think I would consider this fairly strong. I build this almost every game. I like it a lot. The next one, pure range build, the thrower duelist, is for bros that have a decent range skill, has fairly low requirements because it's an extended build of the early thrower, and this is kind of a little bit more elite build, more for later game. You have Colossus, Dodge, Pathfinder, and Gifted, and again throwing mastery for additional damage. It's a nimble build, of course, with Berserk, Killing Frenzy, and Duelist. Because the Duelist perks gives you additional armor ignore if you have your offhand free. That means for one-handed weapons, you get bonus damage. This works on ranged weapons, so the throwing weapons that are one-handed, because the bow, crossbow, and guns, they are two-handed. The throwing weapons are one-handed. So you get bonus armor pen. And this is insane damage, especially with Executioner, Berserk, Killing Frenzy. Really high single target damage. You only need a bro who has decent range skill. Of course, nimble gear with the bundle of throwing axes or javelins. And then in the backpack, you can have a sword for additional hit chance or a spear. And you are even melee a duelist. So these guys tend to be also fairly decent utility for the early, for the mid game, and you can make them out of the throwers that survive the early game, and then they become the thrower duelist for the mid game. These guys even are decent late game against certain enemies if they survive that long. Sometimes these guys can survive fairly long, and yeah, you can build a lot around them. So, all right, this is that. Again, stats, you only fairly low requirements, only need range skill. Then we continue with the Dagger duelist. Like this build a lot, has very low requirements because you only need a bro that has basically any thief can be made into this build. Basically any thief can be made into this build. And the Dagger duelist is an early mid-game build. The whole idea is you go for Dagger mastery, and with Dagger mastery, the action points go down to 3 action points, so you can attack 3 times per turn with the dagger. If we combine this with the quatal dagger, with really high base damage, almost the same damage as the sword, if it high rolls, but you can attack 3 times per turn, not 2 times per turn. And this is insane with duelist. You can actually stab 3 times per turn and do an insane amount of damage to a lot of opponents. Because of the high base damage, it does really well against unarmored opponents. But because of the 3 attacks per turn and the duelist perk, it also does decent damage against medium and high armor opponents. Against highest armor, it will take a while to get through, but even then, because you attack 3 times per turn, it's not too bad to get through armor. It actually works surprisingly well, especially with famed daggers or with the normal daggers that can puncture. Again, really easy to make. I like this build a lot. Basically any thief that has a decent melee defense attack and some initiative can be made into this build. I like to go for Colossus, Dodge, Pathfinder, Gift, and Student is always a free perk. So if you can squeeze in Student on your mid game or late game bros, I always take Student. On the early game bros, doesn't make sense because most of them die. But on the late game bros, I always take Student because it's technically a free perk. Yeah. Anyways, I went for Underdog, Nimble, Killing Frenzy, Berserk, and of course Duelist. So really nice tempo build for early mid game. Still strong damage in the late game, but the defense of Nimble Dodge drops off late game. So yeah, this is one of the downsides. You could swap Gifted for Overwhelm and level more initiative on your bro. Is also a really strong variant of this build. But you can decide, right? If you go Gifted or Overwhelm. Depends on your bro, it depends on your playstyle. You can do both. You can take also Relentless and go full in on the dodge build. This is also up to you. Fairly flexible, fairly high damage for a bro that has basically no requirement. And that's kind of the upside of this build. And I tend to build more builds for bros that have really low requirements. And I kind of stopped searching for these special builds that kind of need a specific bro that is most of the time fairly hard to find. And I started building more of these builds that can be done with a lot of bros that you just hire. Like they don't have high requirements. Really like this build. Even late game, decent damage if it survives. Speaking about late game, Cleaver, I would say number 1 damage build for late game. Has fairly high requirements. You need a bro that has a lot of fatigue. The stars, they always show how important fatigue is. So you kind of want to aim for 140 fatigue. Bro with 140 fatigue. But also like high 80s melee attack and at least 30 plus melee defense. I always say for Battleforge bros, you want to have 30 plus melee defense. It's kind of the baseline. It requires full Battleforge armor and of course the two-handed scimitar or the other cleavers. Yeah, the benefit of the cleaver is it's the only two-handed weapon that attacks twice per turn, so the damage is insane. You basically have a duelist weapon without the duelist perk, because you are a two-hander with really high base damage, and the damage from this thing, especially with Decapitate, goes through the roof, especially against unarmored opponents, and even against armored opponents. even with feint version, especially with feint versions, it's just really, really high DPS in general. So this build is fairly tight. It is very perk and stat intensive. So you need a good bro. Somebody like the Lone Wolf can be made into this build really easily. And I went for Pathfinder, Steelbro Colossus for the defense, then Underdog Battleforge, also for the defensive perks. Recover is necessary because if you Berserk, you can recover on 4 action points weapons. And because you basically gain the 4 action points, so you can hit, if you make a kill, then you can recover after that. That's really, really nice. So the Berserk recover combination, really good on these bros that just, these bros who hit twice or 3 times per turn, they need a lot of fatigue and they accumulate a lot of fatigue. So recover is kind of mandatory on this build. Especially, but it's also really nice to use because of the Berserk recover combo with 4 action point weapons. So then we have Killing Frenzy. That's kind of the classic combo, Berserk Killing Frenzy. With Cleaver Mastery, obviously, it increases the bleed damage and reduces the fatigue. And then you kind of have a flex perk. You can go for Brawny for even more fatigue, which is probably the better variant of this. I went for Executioner because Executioner just is more damage. But if you have a bro who is a little bit lesser fatigue, you might want to do Brawny. You can also don't take Brawny and go Nimble Forge, which gives you even more fatigue. Again, this build is kind of designed around fatigue because every point of fatigue that you have, you will translate into damage. And yeah, in general, I think in Battle Bros, fatigue is damage. This is a very high DPS build. Build it almost every run on my late game bros. This is kind of what I would make. If I find a very good bro, I would make him into a cleaver. You can also do quickhands for the whip, and the disarm combo is also something you can make. Yeah. This is the cleaver. We go to the Mace duelist next. It is designed around the winged mace, and with duelist, this bro shits. This guy just shits out damage. It's insane. It has, especially because you have 40% base armor ignore on the mace already. With duelist, this goes to 65%. So the hits to kill on medium armor, low HP opponents, something like Ancient Undead or the Noble House units, are just insane. This is like, I think, the best damage against Noble House and Ancient Undead. Very high DPS, insane DPS, same like the cleaver, the Berserk recover combination, and of course the basic defensive perks, Battleforge, then a Berserk Killing Frenzy, Mace Mastery, obviously, and then you start clubbing down your opponents. A very high DPS, same as the cleaver, has basically the same requirements as a cleaver. You need somebody with good melee defense, attack, and high fatigue, but still decent hit points and resolve to be like a frontliner, right? Yeah, generally for Battleforge, I would consider 85 plus hit points is kind of the things you need, and you want to have 40 plus resolve. That's kind of what I always try to achieve on my bros. And yeah, these are kind of the end stats almost on basically every Battleforge guy. I always level melee defense and attack because these are the important primary stats. And then I try to have 40 resolve and 85 hit points after Colossus. And then everything else I pump into fatigue. That's kind of how I build my Battleforge bros. And yeah, again, this is like the cleaver, but it's with the duelist perk. So you have 1 perk less to spend on this, so you can't go for Brawny or Executioner. This build is very similar, though, in terms of damage. Like really high damage. It has higher DPS. It has lower times to kill on these certain opponents. So again, more or less the same build, more or less the same output. It is just against different opponents, it is just better. So against low armor, against medium armor, low HP, these bros are just the best. And against high HP, late game bros, late games stuff like orcs and chosen, the cleaver is probably the better weapon. But both of them shit out a shit ton of damage. Really like them. Then we come to the Mace quatal. And the Mace quatal build is basically you combine a two-handed mace with the quatal. And this is also a generic frontline build. You need a decent, but you need less fatigue on this build. You can get away with fairly low fatigue on this build, but you still need 30 plus melee defense and like 80 plus attack, like 85 plus attack is important on this build. And the whole idea is you take the Dagger mastery, so you can swap to the Dagger with quickhands after you attacked with the Mace, and the Mace does the daze on an opponent, and then you come in with the second attack of the quatal, the death blow, which does more armor penetration, more armor damage against an opponent that is dazed. This is kind of the combo. But this is not only, this is kind of like the main damage combo, but this build is so flexible, just beyond this kind of like small trick that's kind of like actually irrelevant to me, because you have just the utility of a big two-handed mace, which is really good against opponents that you want to stun. It is also really good against opponents that you just want to kill fast, like against heavy armor opponents like Orc Warriors and Chosen. You just do so much armor damage and general damage with the mace. But against smaller opponents, you can just swap to the Dagger. So for instance, if you fight goblins, and you can just start one-shotting the goblins with 3 or 4 attacks per turn. So this build shines against basically any opponents, because you have the big two-handed weapon to deal with the big opponents, and you have the Dagger to deal with the small opponents, the low hit points opponents. So that's why I like this build. It's probably my favorite late game build, just because of the flexibility. These guys are most of the time, together with the cleavers and the Mace duelist, my high skill count bros. And yeah, I really like them. Also, they don't need that much fatigue, because the Dagger doesn't need much fatigue to use. And if you just the Mace without mastery, you know, that's kind of like the problem. You are kind of missing a perk. You want to have Mace mastery, so you could swap duelist for Mace mastery. What you also can do is you can swap quickhands for the duelist, and so you ignore the basic combo of the Mace, quickhands, Dagger. This is kind of like you ignore that and just become the utility of being a Battleforge guy who has a Mace, but also a Dagger in the backpack. And you have basically the combination of the Dagger duelist and the generic Mace Battleforge guy, which is also very strong in my opponent. But again, the generic combination is this. Again, you could swap out duelist for this, or you could swap out Pathfinder. But I really like Pathfinder, especially with the Dagger, because you can actually walk 3 tiles and still attack with the Dagger. That's what I really like. Why I really like Pathfinder on this build. But yeah, really flexible. Really, really like this build. High damage against basically any opponent, and yeah, you can either become a Dagger duelist or a big Mace guy. The generic Mace Battleforge build is obviously just without the duelist and the Dagger mastery. You just would take the Mace mastery, and then you can take another damage perk or another flexibility perk. You can just go for Gifted Executioner, Headhunter, Fearsome, Brawny, whatever you want, right? You are very flexible with the generic Mace, two-hander Battleforge. I didn't make a special build for this because I think the Mace quatal is just superior. But again, the Mace is just the Mace quatal build, who just swap some perks around, right? Again, I like this build because it has fairly low requirements for Battleforge. For somebody who is Battleforge, you can make basically almost any highborn into this. And so especially something like Oath Takers, who tend to have lower fatigue, but have decent ground stats in melee defense, attack, and hit points and resolve. I tend to make these for oath takers because they have lower fatigue requirements, and still good on hedge knights, right? Or adventurous nobles who also tend to have lower stats, right? Really flexible, and I like this build not only for its flexibility, but also because it is really easy to make, and even a lot of low bonds that have good stats can be made into a Mace quatal bros if you really want to invest into that. All right, next one. Great Axe Quickhand, another generic Battleforge frontline build. Again, what I like about this build, it has lower fatigue requirements. It has, but you still need, again, 30 plus and 80, 30 plus melee defense, something like 80 attacks and still decent fatigue. The trick is you basically go the generic Battleforge build with Steel Bow and Battleforge Killing Frenzy and stuff. Axe Mastery, obviously. Then you go quickhands, so you can swap you can kind of quick swap to the Reach Axe that has a range of 2 tiles and hit. What I like about this build is we have fairly low requirements in fatigues, and also the melee attack can be a little bit lower. Even if you have 80, is okay, right? But yeah, you kind of want to have decent attack and decent defense. You have fairly low fatigue requirements. You can make this also in Battleforge neutral. It has high synergy with Fearsome because the Great Axe basically hits a second body part for the second time, so you proc 2 Fearsome checks. Again, this is good for fatigue neutral that I don't like, and this is also a build I do not recommend because I hate this perk. I think the generic Berserk Killing Frenzy builds are just way superior in any type of form, and especially with Brawny, you can make even bros that have 100 or 110 fatigue into full Battleforge Killing Frenzy Berserk damage dealing machines, and I don't know why people build fatigue neutral, but this build is also decent on fatigue neutral. Again, just quickhand, Axe Mastery with Fearsome or something like Executioner for another damage perk if you don't like the Fearsome. You can make this make a fairly low requirements bro into a really high damage dealer. The Axe is just generically very high damage with high armor ignore, high armor effectiveness, so this weapon is generically good against basically any opponents. That's why it's really low requirement, but really high damage output for low requirements. I really like this. The Great Axe frontline Battleforge build. So these are kind of like the 4 generic Battleforge builds that I tend to build. The Cleaver and Mace duelist have high fatigue requirements, so they require special better bros. The Great Axe and the Mace quatal have lower fatigue and lower melee attack requirements. Especially the Mace quatal can have lower melee attack requirements because you can just play him as a Battleforge Dagger duelist, technically. So even somebody who has like 70 melee attack is still technically usable for quatal Dagger, at least. It's not that usable for the Mace part, but good for the quatal. So you can even make low bonds theoretically into this build. It's not that strong, but it would still work. That's why what I like about these builds. They are the Great Axe and the Mace quatal have really low requirements in terms of bros. So now we come to the specialist builds. And the specialist builds, I will start with the Flail Brute Headhunter build. This is all about the 2-handed Flail and the Headhunter perk. What I will say is this: if you find a bro that has the Brute's trait, Brute does 15% additional damage on a headshot, but you have negative 5 melee skill. So if you find a highborn, a hedge knight, or an oath taker or something, sellswords, gladiators, or somebody who has high melee attack and the Brute trait, I would make them into a Flail, 2-handed Flail bro. With Flail Mastery and Headhunter, you have a 40% chance of 2-shotting an Orc Warrior. Full to 0. Without active Killing Frenzy, without Executioner, without the Famed Flail. Just 40% of 2-shotting an Orc Warrior. because you have 40% chance of an headshot with the Flail Mastery. With Headhunter, your next hit will also go guaranteed to the head. So the first hit on the head basically destroys the armor of the Orc Warrior and makes him half HP. The second hit goes guaranteed to the head and kills that Orc Warrior. I like Executioner on this build for additional damage. But obviously you could go for Brawny, Gifted, Fearsome, whatever you like. Right? The generic Battleforge builds, they most of the time have 1 or 2 flex perks, depending on your playstyle. You can swap this around. Requirements you need. On this build is actually you need high attack because of the Brew trait. So having high melee attack is really important. Still 30 plus defense for Battleforge, and it's actually not that fatigue demanding, really, because you maximum hit twice. So especially if you go Brawny Battleforge, it's not that fatigue demanding. But you need really high attack on this build because the Brute. Again, it's a special build for you need to find a Brute that has high melee attack, so a Highborn with the Brute trait. But again, the damage is worth it. It is absolutely insane how much damage these bros do. And with active Killing Frenzy, Executioner, and with Famed Weapons, you can one-shot opponents that most other weapons can't one-shot. On a headshot, by the way. So, really strong build, highly recommended, but you need a very special bro for that. Let's go to the next build. This is the Hammer build. I kind of consider this also a special build. You can just make a generic two-handed Battleforge guy, just go the Battleforge skills and make him Hammer Mastery, Brawny, Battleforge, something, But this build is more specialized because we want to be on the left flank to AOE. We want to abuse the AOE attack of the two-handed hammer. This is the secondary attack, and it hits 3 targets counterclockwise. So you would take this bro on the left flank, and then with reach advantage, Executioner, we have additional damage against wounded opponents and more melee defense for every target that we hit. So because we constantly AoE, we have a lot of melee defense on the left flank. And because of the Executioner, if we basically hit 3 opponents and we wound, if you hit something with a big two-handed weapon, it's almost always a wounded, that opponent is almost always wounded. And then you have the Executioner who does 20% more damage against the wounded opponent. So this bro shits out a shit ton of damage, but again, this bro has really high requirements. You actually need a bro who has high defense, high offense, and really high fatigue to make this work. This is kind of like for a lone wolf bro. And that's kind of the point. It is very special. You need a very high... You basically need a god bro to make this work, and the outcome is not that... It's more of a meme build, I would say. I would say just make this guy into a generic two-handed hammer version is just better with a bro who has lower stats. And just take the hammer mastery and go for I don't know, other damage perks, like maybe Brawny for more fatigue or Gifted or something. But this is kind of like somebody, if you find somebody who has really high stats and you want to have somebody who can hold a flank on their own, the left flank particularly, you can make this guy into an AoE damage machine. This is kind of like late game AoE. It's basically like the swing from the sword, but this, obviously, it's the hammer. It has way more armor penetration and armor effectiveness, so it's much stronger against Chosen and Orc Warriors. Also has this Dagger effect, which is really good against slow, big targets, because it slows them down further. So this is the hammer build. The second build, this is AoE damage build, late game. The Bardiche is an AoE damage build as well, because the Bardiche is a great axe that has the split from the sword, so it can hit 2 targets in a straight line. Same idea. You basically make this guy a generic axe guy, but you go for a little bit more damage, I would say. I like Executioner and Brawny. You need more fatigue on this build. Again, you need a bro who has high defense, high offense, and fairly high fatigue. This build is fairly demanding, especially on the fatigue side, because you want to AoE a lot, and the AoE cost on the axe on the Bardiche is really high. I think it's like 25 fatigue or something. So if you do that twice per turn, it's like you build up fatigue a lot. You might want to consider recover on this build even. But you also can go brawny. You can also do nimble forge instead of brawny for even more fatigue. But that's up to you, right? If you want to build this. Generally, it's a late game build, late game AOE frontline damage build. Has really high requirements in terms of recruit, but it can be really high damage. So now, next one. The bro that you kind of always build everyone is the Bannerman. But it's a special build, but because you only want to have one, never more than one in your build, in your company. And I like to make them Battleforge for more defense. I like to have bros that have high defense. I like to make bros that have high defense into them. But the only requirement for this bro is like having 3 stars in resolve and fairly high base resolve for the rally, right? For the additional stats that you get out with your banner, because this bro is all about having high resolve. You level resolve every time, and then you would probably go for also fatigue, hit points, melee attack, and defense. Kind of fix that out as on the way. You always take Fortified Mind, rally the troops. I really like rotation on this bro. This is like the only bro that I have rotation on, because this guy is in the middle of the formation to give everybody the banner buff. And this guy kind of rotates bros around. That's why I like to make him Battleforge with higher melee defense if I can. So I tend to take Adventurous Nobles, Oath Takers, or Hedge Knights that have low melee attack and I can't make into a late game damage build, but they have high resolve with stars. I like to make these into my late game Bannermans, so I can rotate them into danger and they're not dying. I like to have tanky Bannermans. That's why I always choose Underdog, Steelbow, Colossus, Battleforge, like the high defense perks. You kind of want to recover on this, especially in Geist fights, because you will rally a lot. Against Ancient Undead, you will rally a lot. So recover is kind of nice. Gifted is kind of nice. Again, this is a build that is really flexible. You can do a Cleaver Mastery to Quickhand to a Whip and disarm people. You can do just Quickhands, backs and belts, have throwing weapons with Throwing Mastery and just throw around stuff, or throw flash pots and grenades and whatnot. You can do Fearsome because of the high resolve, and like this is a fairly flexible build. This is how I like to build them, like a tanky kind of frontliner in the backline that I can rotate into danger when one of my frontliners is in danger of dying. Like my frontliner got hit by a chosen, or 2 times he got hit by a chosen, and he's now basically dead if I don't rotate him. So against these really unlucky things that you can't do much about, I like the rotate Bannerman. All right, next thing, Archer. Archer is for me a special build. It requires, basically you want to recruit a Hunter for this, because Hunter have the highest range skill in the game. A Hunter with 2 stars can go up to close to 100 ranged attack, and you kind of want to have 100 ranged attacks. You would also need a Poacher. Poachers are also good for this build, but a Poacher need to have 3 stars in ranged attack in order to make this work. Obviously, if you can find a Hunter with 3 stars ranged attack, that's kind of what you're aiming for. You need also a decent amount of fatigue for this build. And how I made Archers work is I go all out damage. Same with the Crossbow polearm build. I just take my only defensive perk is nimble, and everything else goes into damage. I have Fearsome, Crippling Strikes, Executioner, I have Berserk, Killing Frenzy, and Headhunter. And I also have Bullseye, because the idea, or the only kind of like main reason why I would want to have an Archer is because I want to snipe opponents that are behind cover. I want to snipe Necromancers, I want to snipe Hexens, I want to snipe opponent Arbalesters, Crossbows, Bows, Archers. I want to snipe range guys with low head armor, so I can benefit from the Headhunter perk and the Fearsome perk. I want to kill opponents that are behind cover and that I can't kill with all of my frontline bros, basically. And I have a hard time killing them with my throwing boys or with my crossbow boys. So I want to kill the opponents that are very far away, the opponent archers, also something like goblin shamans, goblin overseers. I want to kill these ones. I also, with crippling strikes executioner, you can, especially in conjunction with the crossbow polearm build with crippling strikes executioner, the crossbows, they tend to strip away armor and wound an opponent, and then my archer can go with the bonus damage from executioner and just has an easier time killing higher armored opponents. So it's even decent against the chosens, but again, bringing range guys into big chosen or big orc fights is something I wouldn't recommend. Lastly, we have the Battleforged tanks and the nimble tanks. The Battleforged tank has, I kind of stopped building them, but they are very good for something like Monolith, and they can be good in certain fights. The idea behind this is you have a bro that only needs shields and heavy armor. You wear the heaviest armor and shields, and you take all the defensive perks. I went for Colossus, Shield Expert, Brawny, Headhunter. Recover is mandatory because you want to spam Indom or Shield Wall, one of the two. Obviously, Battleforged Underdog. I still take Lone Wolf. So the idea behind is this guy you put outside, and you wanna bind multiple opponents with this bro, so your team can deal with lesser opponents. This is kind of the idea behind this build. You really need a bro that has high melee attack, that has high melee defense, and still high resolve hit points and resolve. So a Hedge Knight who low-rolled melee skill can be made into this build fairly easily. And again, you want to spam Indom or Shield Wall and hold down unholds, multiple unholds, multiple Orc Warriors, multiple Chosen. And your backpack, you want to have good shields, and in your backpack you want to have additional shields. So if your opponent split shields, you can just swap to the shields. And yeah, this is how I built them. And the nimble version of this build is obviously you have nimble, not Battleforged. But I also have dodge. Dodge relentless. I would like to have resilient on this build too, but it's hard to squeeze the perk in. I like the resilient on this build. If you can squeeze the perk in, please do. Again, same. The nimble tank has lower requirements. You still need high melee defense, but has lower requirements in terms of hit point, especially fatigue, because you wear lighter armor. And what I really like about the nimble tank is you have so much. You can gain so much defense from dodge, and especially with the dodge relentless combo, every time you recover, you gain more defense from dodge. That's what I really like about this build, and this is why I prefer nimble tanks to Battleforged tanks, because Battleforged tanks, they tend to die when I have to recover after I used Indom or Spear or Shield Walls. So the Battleforged tanks, you kind of need a bro with Iron Lungs to make a really good Battleforged tank, and then the Battleforged tank is stronger than the nimble tank. What I liked about the nimble tank is you can take basically any thief who has like 1 or 2 stars in melee defense and can get to like 30 plus melee defense without a shield wall, and make this guy into a giga tank with a very low requirement bro, basically. Yeah, most thieves can mate into nimble tanks, and they can be very strong at being a nimble tank because of the recover dodge relentless combo. Especially with Lone Wolf, you can have 100 plus melee defense. It's just nuts how high defense you can achieve with a bro that has very low stats to begin with. You can also try to make a nimble tank out of your early spear guy, or kind of make a hybrid build between the nimble tank. You know, just go for Indom nimble, spear mastery, shield expert, and then you have like a hybrid build between the early game spear guy and the special nimble tank build. All right. Again, I stopped building dedicated tank most of the time, but I kind of have use for early mid-game spear mastery, shield wall, dodge, Indom, nimble combo, right? This hybrid is pretty useful, and yeah. All right, guys, this is the whole tier list. Not list. This is the whole build list, the whole build guide for all the builds that I use. These are the most common builds that work very well. Again, you want to transition, you want to build this early for your bros, then you kind of want to transition to the early mid-game bros, and then late game, most of the late game builds require good bros, right? And the early game bros have basically no requirements. You take whatever you can get. And the mid game bros, most of the mid game builds have the good option of having low requirements in terms of bros, and they tend to be even relevant to late game. And the best late game builds, like the Mace quatals and something like this, they have really low requirements. So even low bonds can be made into these late game builds, the Battleforge Mace quatal builds. Yeah, these are all of my builds that I kind of currently use. Again, there are more special builds, and there are multiple variants of the builds, and some people will prioritize fast rotation over Colossus. Some people just like to go Colossus gifted dodge, and there are many versions of these builds. And this is just a generic guide for maybe newer people who are asking themselves what kind of stuff is good, what kind of stuff works. And this is what generally works most of the time the best. And obviously the advanced players, they don't need this tier list, this guide list. They already know what they are doing. But anyways, maybe there are some older players that have gotten new idea because of this list. And no matter what, guys, thank you so much for watching. This is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will definitely see you in the next video. I do live streams as well, if you want to watch there. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and I see you in the comments. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.